The 42nd floor of the Montgomery Tower offered a pristine view of San Francisco Bay, but Avery Lynn wasn't looking at the water. She sat perfectly still in the leather chair across from her soon-to-be ex-husband, watching Jason Cole's manicured fingers slide the final divorce decree toward her with practiced casualness. "Just sign here, and here," he said, his voice carrying that familiar blend of charm and condescension that had once made her feel protected. Now it made her skin crawl. The conference room smelled of leather and expensive cologne, Jason's cologne. She realized with a bitter twist of recognition. Even here, in this sterile temple of legal procedure, he managed to mark his territory. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were dissolving their marriage in the same building where she'd first pitched Novacor to investors 3 years ago. Back when Jason had stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, whispering encouragement in her ear. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Avery, Jason's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Hendricks, prompted gently. "Do you need a moment to review the terms again?" Avery's own attorney, a kind but overworked man named David Chen, leaned forward slightly. She could feel his concern radiating across the mahogany table. They'd been through this a dozen times in the past month. The numbers were burned into her memory like a brand. Jason Cole, 50% ownership of Novacor Technologies. Avery Lynn, 50% ownership of Novacor Technologies. Joint custody of their shared intellectual property. Equal voting rights on all major business decisions. The company she'd conceived in her dorm room at Stanford. The platform she'd coded during 18-hour days fueled by nothing but determination and Red Bull. The vision that had kept her awake for months, sketching algorithms on napkins and whiteboards until her roommate Maya had finally dragged her to that fateful hackathon where everything changed. "I don't need to review anything," Avery said quietly, accepting the Mont Blanc pen from Patricia's outstretched hand. The weight of it felt disproportionate to the simple action of signing her name. As she wrote her signature clean, precise strokes that gave away nothing of the storm raging inside her chest, she caught Jason's reflection in the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows. He was smiling, not the warm, genuine smile she'd fallen in love with during their second year at Stanford, but something colder, more calculated. "There," she said, setting the pen down with deliberate care. "It's done." Jason reached across the table, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light as he collected the papers. She noticed he was still wearing it, probably for the optics. Jason always thought 3 moves ahead when it came to managing perceptions. "You know," he said, straightening his tie with one hand while organizing the documents with the other. "This doesn't have to change anything fundamental about Novacor. We're both adults. We both want the company to succeed. The word hit her like a physical blow. There had never been a we when it came to Novacor. Not really. Jason had been there for the fundraising dinners and the press interviews, charming investors with his easy confidence and legal expertise. He'd been the one to suggest incorporating in Delaware, to structure the equity distribution, to negotiate the office lease in Soma. But he'd never written a single line of code, never spent sleepless nights debugging deployment issues or crafting user experience flows. "Of course," Avery replied, her voice steady. "The company comes first." David Chen cleared his throat softly. "If there's nothing else, I think we can consider this matter concluded." He began gathering his papers, movements efficient and practiced. Avery wondered how many marriages he'd helped dissolve in this very room, how many partnerships he'd watched crumble under the weight of ambition and betrayal. Jason stood first, buttoning his navy Tom Ford suit jacket with practiced ease. Even in divorce proceedings, he dressed like he was heading to a board meeting, which Avery realized with a start, he probably was. Novacor's quarterly review was scheduled for later that afternoon. Their quarterly review. She was going to have to get used to thinking in plural terms now, even though the thought made her stomach turn. "Walk me out," Jason asked, though it wasn't really a question. He was already moving toward the door, expecting her to follow like she always had. Avery found herself nodding, muscle memory overriding her better judgment. They walked in silence toward the elevator bank, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Patricia and David trailed behind them, a respectful distance away, probably discussing billing procedures or lunch plans or anything other than the dissolution they'd just witnessed. "You know," Jason said as they waited for the elevator, his voice dropping to the intimate register he'd always used when he wanted to make her feel like they were the only two people in the world. None of this changes what we built together. Novacore is still going to change how enterprise software thinks about user authentication. That vision, our vision, that's still intact. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Avery stepped inside, her reflection multiplying infinitely in the mirrored walls. Jason followed, pressing the button for the lobby with the same casual authority he brought to every interaction. That was never our vision, Jason, she said quietly, watching the floor numbers descend. That was mine. You just helped me package it for investors. For a moment, his mask slipped. She saw something flicker across his features, surprise, maybe, or irritation that she wasn't playing along with his carefully constructed narrative. Then it was gone, replaced by that practiced concern that had fooled her for so many months. Avery, I know you're hurt, I'm not hurt, she interrupted, turning to face him fully for the first time since they'd entered the conference room 3 hours ago. I'm furious. There's a difference. The elevator opened onto the marble lobby. All glass and steel and echoing voices. Jason stepped out first, then turned back to her with something that might have been genuine regret in his eyes. For what it's worth, he said, I never wanted it to end like this. I hoped we could find a way to work together, to keep building something amazing. Avery stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. Around them, lawyers and executives hurried past, caught up in their own dramas and deadlines. The afternoon sun streamed through the lobby's massive windows, casting everything in golden light that should have been beautiful but instead felt harsh and exposing. You want to know what's amazing, Jason? She said, adjusting the strap of her leather messenger bag, the same bag she'd carried to every pitch meeting, every client presentation, every late-night strategy session that had built Novacore from nothing into a $20 million company. What's amazing is that you actually think you deserve half of something you had no part in creating. She saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. There it was, the flash of anger he worked so hard to keep hidden, the side of him that had emerged during their marriage's final months, when her success had started to outshine his contributions and he'd begun finding subtle ways to diminish her role in every conversation. I think you're forgetting that your legal expertise helped me navigate incorporation paperwork. Avery cut him off. It didn't create the algorithm that processes authentication requests 20% faster than our nearest competitor. It didn't design the user interface that won us the TechCrunch Disruptor Award. And it sure as hell didn't convince Maya Rios to leave her job at Google to join a startup run by a 24-year-old with no management experience. People were starting to stare. Avery could feel their attention like heat on her skin, but she didn't care. She'd spent 3 years being the supportive wife, the collaborative co-founder, the woman who smiled and nodded when Jason introduced himself as Novacore's co-CEO, even though the company had never had co-CEOs and she'd been running operations since day one. You're being emotional, Jason said, his voice taking on that infuriatingly patient tone he used when he wanted to make her feel unstable. I understand you're processing a lot right now, but we're partners in this. We always have been. No, Avery said simply. We were married. That made us partners in life, not in business. But you used our marriage to manipulate me into signing papers I didn't fully understand, trusting legal advice from someone whose primary interest was protecting your assets. Not mine. She watched him process this, saw the calculation behind his eyes as he weighed his response. Jason had always been a master at reading rooms, at knowing exactly what to say to get the outcome he wanted. It was part of what had made him so effective at fundraising, so compelling to investors who were used to dealing with brilliant but socially awkward founders. He was the smooth operator to her technical genius, the face to her brain, except now she understood that he'd been playing a longer game all along. Avery, he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to that gentle, reasonable tone that had once made her feel cherished. I know this is hard, but we can make this work. Novacore is bigger than both of us now. It's bigger than whatever personal issues we're dealing with. She almost laughed. Personal issues. As if discovering that your husband had been systematically positioning himself to claim credit for your life's work was just a minor relationship hiccup. You're right about one thing, she said, backing toward the revolving doors that led to Montgomery Street. Novacore is bigger than both of us. It's also bigger than you. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the lobby with his mouth slightly open, probably calculating how to spin this interaction for maximum advantage. The revolving door swept her out onto the busy sidewalk, where the fog was just beginning to roll in from the bay and the late afternoon crowd was rushing toward BART stations and parking garages. Avery pulled out her phone and scrolled to Maya's contact, then stopped. Not yet. She needed time to think, to process what had just happened and what it meant for everything she'd worked to build. Instead, she started walking toward the Embarcadero, letting the familiar rhythm of her heels against concrete clear her head. The city rushed past her in a blur of suits and smartphones, everyone hurrying toward their next meeting or appointment or carefully scheduled life event. As she walked, one thought crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. Jason thought he'd won. He thought he'd outmaneuvered her, used her trust and their shared history to claim half of something he'd never truly contributed to. He thought she'd accept this new reality, fall into line as his co-CEO and business partner, grateful for whatever scraps of leadership he was willing to share. He was wrong. Avery Lynn had built one company from nothing. She could do it again, and this time, she'd make sure Jason Cole learned the difference between partnership and theft. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Avery Lynn sat in Dr. Sarah Weinstein's office on Divisadero Street, staring at a box of tissues she hadn't touched and answering questions about her healing process with the kind of measured responses that would make anyone believe she was working through her grief in a healthy, productive way. "How are you sleeping?" Dr. Weinstein asked, her pen poised over a legal pad that Avery suspected contained more observations about her posture and tone than actual notes about their conversation. "Better," Avery lied smoothly. "I've been practicing the meditation exercises you suggested." What she'd actually been doing at 3 in the morning was analyzing Novacore's new website, which had gone live the previous Friday with a redesign that made her want to throw her laptop across the room. Jason had hired some boutique agency in Palo Alto to refresh the brand identity, and they'd somehow managed to strip away everything that had made Novacore feel innovative and personal. The clean, minimalist aesthetic she'd carefully cultivated had been replaced with generic corporate stock photos and buzzword-heavy copy that sounded like it had been written by a committee of MBA students. "That's wonderful progress," Dr. Weinstein said, making a note. "And have you given any thought to what you might want to do professionally? I know the situation with the company is complicated, but sometimes having a project to focus on can be incredibly healing." Avery nodded thoughtfully, as if this were the first time the idea had occurred to her. "I've been thinking about taking some time off, maybe traveling. Jason always said I worked too hard." Another lie. Jason had never complained about her work ethic, he'd relied on it. But Dr. Weinstein didn't need to know that Avery had spent the past week systematically cataloging every misstep Jason had made since taking operational control of Novacore. The list was longer than she'd expected and more damaging than she'd dared hope. After her therapy session, Avery walked down Fillmore Street toward the cafe where she'd arranged to meet Maya. It was a deliberate choice. Cafe International was the kind of aggressively hip coffee shop that attracted freelancers and artists, not tech workers. The chances of running into anyone from their industry were minimal. Maya was already there when Avery arrived, hunched over her laptop in a corner booth, her dark hair falling across her face as she typed. She looked up when Avery approached, and her expression immediately shifted from focused concentration to concerned scrutiny. "You look terrible," Maya said without preamble, closing her laptop and sliding it into her bag. "When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours?" "Good to see you too," Avery replied, settling into the worn leather seat across from her best friend. "How's life at Novacore without me?" Maya's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Frustrating." That single word contained volumes. Maya Rios had been Avery's first hire at Novacore, poached from Google where she'd been wasting her talent building incremental improvements to search algorithms. She was brilliant, loyal, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to translate user needs into elegant product features. She was also, Avery knew, deeply uncomfortable with Jason's management style. "Tell me," Avery said, signaling the waitress for coffee. Maya glanced around the cafe, checking for familiar faces, then leaned forward slightly. "He's making decisions without consulting the product team. Yesterday he approved a feature roadmap that completely ignores the user research we spent 6 months conducting." What kind of decisions? Integration partnerships with companies that don't align with our values. A pivot toward enterprise clients that would fundamentally change our user experience. He's talking about licensing our authentication protocol to a military contractor. Avery felt something cold settle in her stomach. Novacore had been built on principles of user privacy and democratic access to secure technology. The idea of their code being used for surveillance or military applications was antithetical to everything she'd envisioned for the company. How's the team responding? Ravi's barely speaking in meetings. Sarah from UX asked me if there are any openings at my old company. Dev morale is in the toilet. Maya paused, studying Avery's face. People are asking about you. They want to know if you're coming back. What do you tell them? That you're taking time to figure things out. Maya's dark eyes searched Avery's face. Are you figuring things out? Avery took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to consider her response. Maya had been her closest friend since college, the one person who'd believed in Novacore, even when it was just sketches on whiteboards and late-night coding sessions. If anyone deserved to know what she was really thinking, it was Maya. I've been doing some research, Avery said carefully, looking into Jason's business practices, his decisions since the divorce, and I think he's going to run Novacore into the ground within 6 months. Maya leaned back in her seat, processing this. Because he doesn't understand the product, or because he's actively trying to destroy what you built? Both? Neither. I think he genuinely believes he can do what I did, but better. He thinks my approach was too idealistic, too focused on user experience at the expense of profit margins. Avery set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. He's wrong. So what are you going to do about it? The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither of them had spoken aloud yet. Avery looked around the cafe, taking in the eclectic mix of laptops and notebooks, the conversations about art projects and freelance gigs and creative ventures that existed outside the conventional tech ecosystem. What if I told you I was thinking about building something new? Avery said quietly. Something that could do everything Novacore does, but better, more secure, more user-friendly, more aligned with what we originally set out to create. Maya's eyes widened slightly. I'd say that sounds like a non-compete violation that could land you in legal trouble. What if I told you I'd already talked to a lawyer about that, and that there might be ways to structure something that wouldn't violate any existing agreements? I'd ask who the lawyer is. Elijah Tran. Maya blinked in surprise. Your old Manny from Stanford? The IP guy who left Morrison and Associates. He's been thinking about starting his own practice, focusing on emerging tech companies. We had coffee last week to catch up, and the conversation got interesting. This was true, though Avery was leaving out several crucial details. Elijah Tran wasn't just thinking about starting his own practice, he was actively building one, with backing from a group of investors who were frustrated with the traditional legal establishment's inability to understand rapidly evolving technology. He was also, as it turned out, deeply concerned about the ethical implications of how tech companies were handling user data and security protocols. When Avery had casually mentioned her situation during their coffee meeting, Elijah had spent 20 minutes outlining various legal strategies that could theoretically allow someone in her position to compete with their former company without running afoul of non-compete clauses or intellectual property restrictions. Theoretically, this is crazy, Maya said, but her voice lacked conviction. You're talking about going up against Jason, against Novacore, against everything we built together. No, Avery said firmly. I'm talking about saving everything we built together. Jason's going to destroy it anyway. I'd just be accelerating the timeline. Maya was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. Finally, she looked up at Avery with an expression that was part excitement, part terror. You're serious about this? I'm serious about not letting Jason turn 3 years of work into another generic enterprise software company that treats users like data points instead of people. And you think we could actually pull it off? Build something that competes directly with Novacore? I think, Avery said, leaning forward slightly, that we could build something that makes Novacore irrelevant. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and exhilarating. Maya's laptop bag sat on the table, containing code reviews and product specifications for features that Jason would probably kill or fundamentally alter before they ever reached users. All that work, all those late nights and creative breakthroughs, slowly being dismantled in service of Jason's vision of what tech success should look like. "What would you need from me?" Maya asked quietly. "I'd need you to trust me, and I'd need you to be willing to walk away from your equity at Novacore." Maya laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "My equity? That's tied to Jason's decisions. About the company's direction? My equity in a company that's pivoting away from everything I believe in. I don't think that's going to be worth much in a year anyway, so you'll think about it?" "I'll do more than think about it." Maya pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "How soon do you need an answer?" "Soon. Elijah thinks we have a narrow window before Jason makes changes that would make it harder to compete. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast." Maya nodded, her expression shifting into the focused, determined look Avery remembered from their earliest days at Novacore, when they'd worked 18-hour days because they believed they were building something that mattered. "There's something else," Maya said. "Something you should know before you make any final decisions." "What?" "Jason's been telling people that you're having a breakdown, that the divorce was harder on you than anyone realized, and that you're not thinking clearly about business decisions." Maya's jaw tightened. "He's positioning himself as the stable one, the responsible co-founder who's keeping the company running while you work through your personal issues." Avery felt a familiar surge of cold anger, but this time it was accompanied by something else: satisfaction. Jason was making the same mistake he'd always made. He was underestimating her. He thought her absence from Novacore's daily operations meant she was weak, defeated, irrelevant. He had no idea that she was using his own assumptions against him, gathering intelligence while he thought she was falling apart. "Perfect," she said. Maya looked confused. "Perfect? Let him think I'm having a breakdown. Let him think I'm out of the game, licking my wounds and attending therapy sessions." Avery's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "It'll make what happens next so much more satisfying." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts of what they were about to attempt. As they prepared to leave, Maya reached across the table and squeezed Avery's hand. "For what it's worth," she said, "I never thought you were having a breakdown. I thought you were planning something." "What gave it away?" "You stopped posting on social media. You, who used to document every product meeting and team lunch, went completely dark." "That's not grief behavior, that's strategic invisibility." Avery laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in weeks. "You know me too well. Well enough to know that Jason Cole has no idea what he's about to face." They walked out of the cafe together, separating at the corner with a plan to meet again in 3 days. Maya would submit her resignation to Novacore by the end of the week, citing personal reasons and a desire to explore other opportunities. She would be professional, cordial, and give no indication that she was about to help build Novacore's most dangerous competitor. As Avery walked back toward her apartment, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to Elijah's contact. Time to move beyond theoretical discussions and into concrete planning. The message she sent was brief: "We're not rebuilding Novacore. We're out-evolving it." His response came back within minutes: "When do we start?" Avery looked up at the San Francisco skyline, at the gleaming towers, where Jason was probably sitting in what used to be her office, making decisions about what used to be her company. Soon, she thought. Very soon, he would understand the difference between taking something and earning it. But first, she had a company to build in the shadows. Hot she was finished. He didn't know her at all. The loft in the Mission District smelled like sawdust and possibility. Avery stood in the center of the empty space, watching afternoon light stream through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the city's southern skyline. At 3,500 square feet, it was larger than Novacore's first office had been, but the rent was a fraction of what Jason was probably paying for their new Soma headquarters. The previous tenant was an art collective, Elijah Tran explained, setting down his briefcase and pulling out a folder thick with incorporation documents. They left behind some interesting infrastructure: separate electrical circuits, soundproofed meeting rooms, even a server closet that's already wired for fiber. Maya emerged from what would become their main workspace, her sneakers echoing against the polished concrete floors. "It's perfect," she said simply. "Isolated enough that we won't have surprise visitors, but accessible enough that we can bring people here when we need to." Avery nodded, already visualizing how the space would function. Open workspace for the development team, glass-walled meeting rooms for client calls, a kitchen area where they could work late without having to venture out for food. Most importantly, no corporate branding, No Novacor logo staring down at them from conference room walls. No reminders of what Jason had taken from her. Have you decided on a name? Elijah asked, spreading papers across a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Helix Labs, Avery replied without hesitation. She'd been thinking about it for days, testing different combinations and acronyms until she found something that felt right. Helix, the fundamental structure of genetic code, the blueprint for evolution. I like it, Maya said, settling into one of the folding chairs they'd brought with them. It suggests innovation without being too obvious about what we're building. Elijah was already making notes in his precise handwriting. Helix Labs LLC, Delaware Incorporation for tax advantages, but will establish primary operations here, in California. I'll file the paperwork tomorrow morning. For the next 3 hours, they sketched out the framework of what would become Jason's worst nightmare. Elijah walked them through the legal architecture. He'd designed a structure so clean and airtight that even Jason's most aggressive lawyers wouldn't be able to find grounds for a lawsuit. Helix Labs would focus on next-generation authentication solutions for privacy-conscious organizations, carefully avoiding any language that might trigger non-compete clauses while positioning themselves to capture exactly the market segment Jason was abandoning. The key, Elijah explained, is that we're not copying Novacor's approach. We're improving on it, taking the foundational concepts in new directions that your former company isn't exploring. Can we talk about equity structure? Maya asked, pulling out her laptop. Because I want to make sure we get this right from the beginning. Avery had been dreading this conversation. At Novacor, equity distribution had been one of their biggest early mistakes, too generous with early employees. Not enough set aside for future hires, Jason somehow ending up with a larger stake than his contributions justified. This time, she was determined to be both fair and strategic. I want you to have 30%, she told Maya. Elijah gets 15 for legal services and serving as our public CEO. That leaves me with 45% controlling interest. Plus, we'll reserve 10% for future hires. Maya looked surprised. 30%? Avery, that's incredibly generous. It's what you've earned, Avery replied firmly. You've been carrying product development at Novacor for the last year while Jason focused on what he calls strategic initiatives. Without you, none of this would be possible. Elijah was taking notes, already thinking through the legal implications. We'll need to be careful about how we structure Maya's departure from Novacor. No sudden resignations, no dramatic exits that might raise suspicions. I've been thinking about that, Maya said. I could say I'm burned out, need a break from tech. Maybe mention wanting to travel or explore teaching opportunities. Something that makes it sound like I'm moving away from startups entirely. Perfect, Avery agreed. And we'll wait at least 2 weeks after your departure before bringing you on officially. Give Jason time to relax, to assume you're really out of the picture. They spend another hour discussing operational details, hiring strategies, technology stack, client acquisition approaches. Maya had already begun reaching out to contacts at potential client companies, carefully framing conversations as research for a future project rather than active business development. Elijah was preparing to file patents for several authentication innovations that built on Novacor's basic architecture while adding security features Jason's team hadn't even considered. There's something else we need to discuss, Avery said. As they began wrapping up their planning session, Ravi, the name hung in the air between them. Ravi Desai had been Novacor's chief technology officer since their series of funding round, brought in specifically to scale their engineering team. He was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely crucial to Novacor's technical operations. He was also, according to Maya's reports, increasingly frustrated with Jason's management decisions. He's been asking questions, Maya said carefully, about you, about where you've been, about whether you're planning to come back. I think he's starting to suspect that Jason isn't as technically competent as he pretends to be. How do you think he'd respond to an offer? Elijah asked. Carefully, Maya replied. Ravi doesn't make impulsive decisions. He'd want to see a solid business plan, proof that we're serious about competing. He'd also want to know that leaving Novacor wouldn't destroy his reputation in the industry. Avery stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city where Novacor's offices occupied. Prime real estate in the financial district. Somewhere up there, Jason was probably in meetings, making decisions about product roadmaps and strategic partnerships without understanding the technical implications of what he was approving. Ravi was probably sitting in those meetings biting his tongue and counting the days until his next equity vesting milestone. I don't want to approach him directly, she said finally. Not yet, but maybe there's a way to let him know that options exist, without putting him in a position where he has to choose sides immediately. What did you have in mind? Maya asked. You still talk to him regularly, right? About technical issues, product development challenges? Almost daily. Jason doesn't understand half of what we're building, so Ravi and I end up collaborating directly on most engineering decisions. Start mentioning problems that Helix could solve, hypothetically. Talk about authentication challenges that Novacore's current architecture can't handle, security concerns that would require fundamental changes to the codebase. Get him thinking about what a next-generation platform might look like. Maya nodded slowly. Plant seeds. Let him reach his own conclusions about whether Novacore is the right place to solve those problems. Exactly. And when he starts asking more specific questions about alternatives, Avery turned back to face them. That's when we know he's ready for a more direct conversation. Elijah was scribbling notes about recruitment strategies and equity packages. We'll need to be prepared to move quickly once we start bringing people over. Jason's going to notice when his top talent starts leaving, and he'll try to counter-offer. Let him, Avery said with satisfaction. Counter-offers just confirm that people are valuable, and they don't address the fundamental problem, which is that talented engineers don't want to work for someone who doesn't understand or respect what they do. They spent the next hour walking through the space, planning office layout and discussing equipment needs. Maya would handle the technical infrastructure, servers, development tools, security protocols. Elijah would manage all legal and regulatory requirements, making sure they stayed ahead of any challenges Jason might throw at them. Avery would focus on product vision and client development, building relationships with potential customers who were dissatisfied with Novacore's new direction. There's one more thing, Avery said as they prepared to leave. I want to set up a culture document. Not the usual corporate values bullshit, but real principles about how we work together and what we're building toward. What kind of principles? Maya asked. Transparency in all client relationships. No partnerships with organizations that compromise. User privacy. Equity-based compensation for everyone, not just founders. And absolute honesty about technical capabilities. No overpromising features we can't deliver. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Basically, Elijah said with a slight smile, everything Jason hasn't been doing at Novacore, everything Jason can't do, Avery corrected. Because he doesn't understand that sustainable business growth comes from actually solving problems, not just convincing people that you've solved them. As they locked up the loft and walked back toward their cars, Avery felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine excitement about the future. For weeks after the divorce, she'd been operating in reactive mode, responding to Jason's moves and trying to minimize damage. Now, for the first time, she was setting the agenda. How long do you think we have before Jason realizes what's happening? Maya asked as they reached the corner where they would part ways. Depends on how long it takes him to notice that his best people are disappearing, Avery replied. My guess is 6 weeks, maybe 8. He's too focused on impressing investors and managing his image to pay attention to day-to-day operations. And when he does notice, Avery's smile was sharp and cold, the expression of someone who had spent months planning for exactly this moment. When he notices, it'll be too late to stop us, but not too late to watch us succeed. She walked back to her car alone, already composing the first draft of Helix Labs' mission statement in her head. Tomorrow, Elijah would file the incorporation papers. Next week, Maya would submit her resignation to Novacore, and within a month, they would begin the systematic dismantling of everything Jason thought he had won. But first, she had a more immediate task: crafting the perfect email to Ravi Desai. Not an offer, not a recruitment pitch, just a casual message from a former colleague who wanted to catch up over coffee. The kind of innocent conversation that could plant seeds of doubt about Novacore's technical direction and water them with carefully chosen questions about what next-generation authentication really required. Avery Lynn had built one company from nothing, only to watch her husband steal half of it through legal manipulation and emotional betrayal. She wasn't going to make the same mistakes twice. This time, she would build something Jason could never touch, never claim, and never understand. And when she was finished, Novacore would be nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happened. When lawyers tried to run tech companies, the revolution would be quiet, professional, and absolutely devastating. It was time to begin. Jason Cole stood at the head of the conference table in Novacore's glass-walled boardroom, gesturing toward the quarterly projections displayed on the 70-inch monitor behind him. The numbers looked impressive: revenue up 18%, client acquisitions ahead of target, market expansion into 3 new verticals. What the board couldn't see from the spreadsheets was the growing instability underneath those polished metrics. As you can see, Jason said, his voice carrying the confident authority that had helped him secure Series B funding 6 months earlier, our strategic pivot toward enterprise clients is already paying dividends. We're moving beyond the startup ecosystem into established markets with real buying power. Board member Jordan Malik nodded approvingly from his seat near the window, but his expression remained carefully neutral. As a partner at Meridian Ventures, Jordan had seen enough quarterly presentations to recognize when founders were telling the story they wanted to believe rather than the story the data actually supported. These client retention numbers, Jordan said, tapping his tablet screen, they seem to have dropped significantly in the last 6 weeks. Any particular reason for that trend? Jason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We've seen some churn. As we've refined our target market, it's normal when a company evolves its positioning. The clients we're losing weren't aligned with our enterprise focus anyway. Jordan made a note. And what about the Techstars cohort companies? I thought they were some of our most enthusiastic early adopters. Claire's been working on a comprehensive retention strategy, Jason replied, nodding toward Claire Martin, who was seated at the far end of the table with a laptop full of marketing presentations she'd spent the weekend preparing. Clara, want to walk us through the upcoming campaign? Clara straightened in her chair, switching to the slide deck she'd titled Novacore 2.0, Scaling Security for the Enterprise Era. The first slide featured a stock photo of diverse professionals shaking hands in front of a city skyline, overlaid with buzzwords like synergy and paradigm shift that made Jordan internally wince. We're launching a multi-channel awareness campaign focused on positioning Novacore as the premier authentication solution for established businesses, Claire began, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd learned to disguise uncertainty with energy. The messaging emphasizes our maturity as a platform, our enterprise-grade security features, and our commitment to scalable solutions. What about our existing brand identity? Asked Sarah Chen, the board's independent member and former CTO of a successful fintech startup. Novacore built its reputation on being developer-friendly and accessible to smaller organizations. We risk alienating that base? Clara glanced nervously at Jason before responding. Market research indicates that enterprise clients prefer vendors with enterprise positioning. We're simply aligning our brand with our growth strategy. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What market research specifically? I don't recall seeing any user studies or customer interviews in the materials you shared. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Clara's face flushed slightly as she clicked through her slides, looking for data that didn't exist. The truth was that Jason had made the strategic pivot decision based on his own assumptions about what constituted serious business growth, without consulting the customer research team or conducting any formal market analysis. We're working with a consultancy to conduct more comprehensive research, Jason interjected smoothly. But the initial feedback from our enterprise prospects has been overwhelmingly positive. Jordan leaned forward slightly. Which prospects specifically? And what's the timeline for converting those conversations into actual contracts? Another pause. Jason was discovering that the boardroom skills that had served him well as a lawyer, confident presentation, strategic omission of inconvenient details, pivot to more favorable topics, were less effective when dealing with experienced investors who asked direct questions and expected specific answers. I'll have Clara send you a detailed pipeline analysis after the meeting, he said. But I want to focus on the bigger picture here. Novacore is positioned to capture a much larger market than we originally targeted. The enterprise authentication space is worth billions, and we're uniquely positioned to claim a significant share. With what technical differentiators? Sarah asked pointedly. Your original competitive advantage was in user experience and deployment simplicity. How does that translate to enterprise sales cycles that prioritize security audits and compliance features? Jason felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced in law school when professors asked questions he hadn't prepared for. The technical aspects of Novacore's product had always been Avery's domain, and even after months of trying to master the details, he still felt like he was speaking a foreign language when the conversation turned to architecture and implementation. Ravi's been leading a comprehensive security enhancement project, he said, turning toward the CTO who had been unusually quiet throughout the presentation. Ravi, want to update the board on our progress? Ravi Desai looked up from his laptop, where he'd been taking notes that had nothing to do with the meeting. For the past hour, he'd been sketching out technical solutions to problems that Jason's strategic pivot was creating authentication bottlenecks that their current architecture couldn't handle efficiently, security requirements that would require fundamental changes to their codebase, integration challenges that no one else in the room seemed to understand. The security enhancements are complex, Ravi said carefully. Enterprise clients have requirements that are significantly different from our current user base. Meeting those requirements without compromising performance is a non-trivial engineering challenge, but it's achievable. Jordan pressed. Ravi hesitated for a moment too long. It would require substantial changes to our core platform, changes that might impact our existing clients' experience. What kind of impact? Sarah asked. Slower authentication speeds, more complex integration processes, additional infrastructure requirements. Ravi's expression was carefully neutral, but anyone who knew him well would recognize the signs of deep frustration. We're essentially talking about building a different product while maintaining backward compatibility with the existing one. Jason jumped in before Ravi could elaborate further. Every scaling company faces these kinds of technical challenges. It's part of growing beyond the startup phase into a mature enterprise. Have you considered the possibility that you're trying to serve two incompatible market segments? Sarah asked. Because from what I'm hearing, your enterprise strategy might cannibalize the strengths that made Novacore successful in the first place. I disagree, Jason replied, though his voice carried less conviction than it had at the beginning of the meeting. We're expanding our addressable market, not abandoning our core competencies. Jordan made another note on his tablet. I'd like to see user retention data broken down by client segment. Specifically, I want to understand whether the churn we're seeing is concentrated among your original customer base or distributed across all segments. Of course, Jason said. Clara will get that to you by end of week. Clara nodded enthusiastically, already calculating how much overtime she'd need to put into compiled data that might or might not support Jason's strategic narrative. She'd been at Novacore for only 3 months, hired specifically to manage the company's image during what Jason had described as a temporary transition period while Avery took time off to deal with personal issues. What she'd discovered instead was a company in the middle of an identity crisis, with a CEO who made decisions based on what sounded impressive in investor meetings rather than what actually served customers. After the board members left, Jason retreated to his office, the corner space that had once been Avery's, though he'd completely redecorated it with modern furniture and abstract art that screamed successful executive. He loosened his tie and stared out at the San Francisco skyline, trying to process the questions that had made him feel uncomfortably exposed. The truth was that Novacore's numbers were starting to worry him. Client churn was accelerating, not just among the smaller startups, but also among some of their most established customers. Support tickets were up 40%, mostly related to performance issues that the engineering team claimed were unavoidable consequences of the security enhancements he'd mandated. 2 of their largest clients had requested meetings to discuss their evolving needs, which Jason suspected was diplomatic language for negotiating their way out of existing contracts. His phone buzzed with a text from Clara. The Techstars companies are asking about alternatives. Should I set up retention calls? Jason stared at the message, feeling a cold knot forming in his stomach. The Techstars portfolio companies had been Novacore's bread and butter for 2 years, providing steady revenue and serving as references for new client acquisition. If they started defecting en masse, it would be nearly impossible to hide the damage from investors. He was about to respond when his assistant knocked on the door. Mr. Cole, Ravi Desai is here to see you. Send him in. Ravi entered the office with the measured pace of someone who'd been rehearsing a difficult conversation. He carried a laptop and a folder full of technical documentation, but his expression suggested this wasn't going to be a routine status update. We need to talk, Ravi said, settling into the chair across from Jason's desk. About the technical feasibility of what you're asking the engineering team to deliver. Jason leaned back in his executive chair, trying to project calm authority, while internally bracing for more bad news. I'm listening. The enterprise security requirements you've committed to, they're not compatible with our current architecture. We'd need to rebuild core components of the authentication system, which would take months and potentially introduce new vulnerabilities. Ravi opened his laptop and turned it toward Jason, displaying a flowchart that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all Jason could understand it. More importantly, those changes would break backward compatibility with existing clients. So we'll manage the transition carefully, Jason replied. Phased rollouts, client communication, technical support. These are solvable problems. They're not just problems, Jason. They're fundamental conflicts between what different customer segments need from our product. Ravi's voice carried a patience that was clearly wearing thin. You can't optimize for enterprise security requirements and maintain the simplicity that makes us attractive to smaller companies. You have to choose. What if we don't choose? What if we build to versions of the platform? With what engineering resources? We're already understaffed for the roadmap you've approved. Building and maintaining two separate products would require doubling our development team, which would burn through our runway in 6 months. Jason felt the familiar sensation of being in over his head, surrounded by technical complexities he didn't fully grasp and strategic implications he hadn't considered. It was the same feeling he'd had during his first month at Novacore, when Avery had patiently explained why certain features would take weeks to implement rather than days, why security couldn't be retrofitted onto existing systems, why user experience required constant iteration rather than one-time design decisions. What do you recommend? He asked, hating how uncertain his voice sounded. I recommend we stop promising features we can't deliver and start focusing on what we do well. Ravi closed his laptop with deliberate precision. Our original customer base loved Novacore because it was fast, reliable, and easy to implement. The enterprise pivot is destroying all three of those advantages, but the market opportunity isn't worth much if we lose our core competencies chasing it, Ravi interrupted. And honestly, Jason, I'm not sure you understand what those competencies are. The words hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to Jason's leadership that neither man could ignore. Jason felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment, but underneath those emotions was something worse, the growing suspicion that Ravi was right. I think we're done here, Jason said stiffly. Ravi stood, gathering his materials with the methodical care of someone who was already mentally checking out. I think we are. After Ravi left, Jason sat alone in his office, staring at quarterly projections that suddenly felt less like achievements and more like carefully constructed illusions. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was asking uncomfortable questions about whether Avery had been right all along about user experience, about sustainable growth, about the difference between building a company and managing one. He pushed those thoughts aside and opened his laptop, pulling up Clara's latest marketing presentation. There had to be a way to fix this, to find the right messaging that would convince clients to stay and investors to keep believing. He just needed to find the right strategy, the right positioning, the right narrative to make everything work. But for the first time since the divorce, Jason Cole was beginning to suspect that narrative might not be enough. Ravi Desai sat in his Tesla in the parking garage beneath Novacore's building, staring at his phone screen and the email he'd been drafting for the past 20 minutes. The resignation letter was polite, professional, and completely inadequate for expressing his frustration with the past 3 months of Jason's leadership. But corporate diplomacy required certain conventions, even when you were walking away from a sinking ship. Dear Jason, the email began. After careful consideration, I have decided to pursue new opportunities outside of Novacore. My last day will be February 28th. Giving you 2 weeks to transition my responsibilities. He deleted the draft and started over, then deleted that one too. The truth was that no amount of corporate speak could capture what was really happening. That He was abandoning a company he'd helped build because its current leadership was systematically destroying everything that had made it worth building in the first place. His phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Coffee and 20. Same place as last time. Ravi looked at the message, then at his laptop bag sitting in the passenger seat, containing the technical documentation for projects that Jason would probably cancel or fundamentally misunderstand within the month. Maya had left Novacor 2 weeks ago, citing burnout and a desire to explore teaching opportunities. But Ravi had known Maya for 3 years, and burnout didn't explain the subtle excitement in her voice when they'd spoken at her goodbye happy hour. He started the car and drove toward the Mission District Cafe where Maya had suggested they meet. The traffic gave him time to think about the conversation that had been weighing on him since his confrontation with Jason the previous week. There were rumors circulating in the tech community, whispers about new startups forming, about innovative approaches to authentication, security, about opportunities for engineers who were tired of working for leaders who prioritized image over substance. Maya was already waiting when he arrived, seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested this wasn't going to be a casual catch-up conversation. You look terrible, she said as he settled into the chair across from her. Thanks. You look annoyingly well rested for someone who's supposed to be taking a break from tech. Maya smiled, the kind of expression that confirmed Ravi's suspicion that her departure from Novacor had been more strategic than spontaneous. Funny thing about breaks, they give you time to think about what you actually want to be working on. And what do you want to be working on? Problems that matter. With people who understand the difference between building technology and selling stories about technology, Maya took a sip of her coffee, studying Ravi's face. What about you? Still enjoying your role as technical translator for Jason's enterprise? Pivot fantasies? Ravi laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Yesterday he asked me if we could add blockchain integration to our authentication protocol. When I asked him what specific problem blockchain would solve, he said it would make us sound more innovative to investors. Jesus, the day before that, he committed to a client demo that would require features we haven't built yet and probably can't build with our current architecture. When I tried to explain the technical constraints, he told me I was being negative and asked if I was aligned with the company's growth vision. Maya nodded sympathetically. Claire's been sending out press releases about our cutting-edge enterprise security solutions that describe capabilities we don't actually have. I spent my last week at Novacor explaining to confused clients why the product they'd read about in TechCrunch didn't match what they could actually download. It's unsustainable, Ravi said, and it's starting to show. We lost 2 major clients last week, both citing performance issues that are direct results of Jason's mandated security enhancements. The engineering team is spending more time fixing problems created by his decisions than building new features. What if I told you there was an alternative? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had spoken aloud yet. Ravi had suspected this conversation was coming. Maya's departure, her carefully neutral responses to his questions about her future plans, the way she'd stayed connected to industry gossip despite claiming to be taking time off. I'd say I'm listening. Maya pulled out her laptop, opening it to a presentation titled Helix Labs, Next Generation Authentication for Privacy-Conscious Organizations. The slides were clean and technically precise, outlining an approach to authentication security that addressed every limitation Ravi had been struggling with at Novacor. We're building something new, Maya said simply. Something that does what Novacor used to do, but better. Faster authentication, stronger security, easier integration. And we're doing it with a team that actually understands the technology. Ravi studied the technical specifications on Maya's screen, his engineer brain immediately recognizing the elegance of the proposed solution. It was exactly what he'd been trying to convince Jason to build at Novacor, a next-generation platform that enhanced security without sacrificing the simplicity that had made their original product successful. Who's we? He asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Smart people who are tired of watching good technology get destroyed by bad management. People who believe that user experience and security aren't mutually exclusive. People who think engineering decisions should be made by engineers, not by lawyers who read about blockchain on TechCrunch. Maya, yes, is Avery involved in this? Maya was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. What would you think if she was? Ravi leaned back in his chair, processing this confirmation of what he'd suspected for weeks. Avery Lynn had been the technical vision behind Novacor from the beginning, the founder who understood both the product and the market in ways that Jason never had. Her absence from the company had been felt immediately, not just in strategic direction but in day-to-day technical decisions that required someone who actually understood what they were building. "I'd think," he said slowly, "that Jason is about to discover the difference between running a company and stealing one." "Hypothetically," Maya said, "if you were interested in working on challenging technical problems with a team that valued engineering excellence over marketing buzzwords, when would you be available to start?" "Hypothetically," Ravi replied, "I've been available since the day Jason asked me to add blockchain to our authentication protocol." They spent the next hour discussing technical details, company culture, and equity structures. Maya walked him through Helix Labs' approach to product development, evidence-based feature prioritization, direct collaboration between engineering and design teams, technical leadership that actually understood the codebase they were responsible for. It was everything Ravi had been missing at Novacor, everything that had made the company exciting to work for before Jason's strategic pivot had turned it into just another enterprise software vendor. "There's one thing you should know before you make a decision," Maya said as they prepared to leave. "This isn't just about building better technology. It's about proving that the way Jason runs companies doesn't work. That sustainable growth comes from solving real problems, not from convincing investors that you've solved them." "Good," Ravi said, "because watching him destroy 3 years of work has been the most frustrating experience of my career." "So you're interested?" "I'm interested. But I want to meet the team first, see the technical roadmap, understand how you're planning to compete with Novacor without triggering legal issues." "Fair enough. Are you free tomorrow evening?" "We're having a strategy session at our office." Ravi nodded, already mentally drafting the resignation email he'd been struggling to write all morning. This version would be shorter, more direct, and much more satisfying to send. That evening, as Ravi sat in his apartment reviewing the technical documentation Maya had shared, Jason Cole was 3 miles away in Novacor's conference room, staring at a client retention report that made his stomach turn. The numbers were worse than he'd feared, not just the 2 major clients he'd known about, but 6 smaller companies that had quietly terminated their contracts over the past month. Clara sat across from him, her laptop open to a damage control strategy that felt increasingly inadequate. "We could offer service credits to address the performance concerns," she suggested, "or expedited support for clients who are experiencing integration issues." "The performance concerns are real," Jason replied, rubbing his temples. "Ravi says the security enhancements are causing authentication delays that some clients can't accept. We can't fix that with service credits. What about rolling back the security updates? That would undermine our enterprise positioning. We'd be admitting that we can't deliver on our promises to larger clients." Clara made notes that she knew wouldn't lead to viable solutions. The fundamental problem wasn't messaging or customer service, it was that Jason had committed to technical capabilities that Novacor couldn't actually provide. Every conversation she had with frustrated clients reinforced this reality, but Jason seemed incapable of accepting that his strategic vision might be technically impossible. "There's something else," Clara said hesitantly. "I've been hearing rumors about a new authentication company called Helix Labs. They're supposedly building next-generation security solutions with better performance than existing platforms." Jason looked up sharply. "What kind of rumors?" "Nothing specific. Just industry gossip about innovative approaches to authentication, backed by experienced engineers. I tried to research them online, but there's almost no public information. No website, no press releases, no LinkedIn profiles for the leadership team. Probably another vaporware startup trying to generate buzz without having an actual product." Jason said dismissively, "The authentication space is crowded enough already." But privately, he felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. New competitors were always emerging in the tech industry, but the timing of these rumors was concerning. If another company was positioning itself to capture the market segment Novacor was struggling to serve, it could accelerate their client defection problems. "Keep monitoring the situation," he told Clara. "If this Helix Labs thing becomes more than rumors, I want to know about it immediately." After Clara left, Jason tried to focus on the quarterly budget review that was due the next morning, but his concentration kept drifting to larger strategic questions he'd been avoiding. The enterprise pivot wasn't working the way he'd envisioned. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that Avery's original approach had been correct. It would mean accepting that his vision for Novacore's growth had been based on assumptions rather than analysis, ego rather than expertise. His phone buzzed with an email notification. Ravi Desai's resignation letter was brief and professional, citing strategic differences and a desire to pursue new challenges. No specific complaints, no detailed explanations, just a polite notification that Novacore's chief technology officer would be leaving in 2 weeks. Jason stared at the email, feeling the familiar sensation of losing control of a situation he'd never fully understood. First Maya, now Ravi, two of the most technically competent people at the company, walking away within a month of each other. The board would want explanations, and Jason wasn't sure he had any that wouldn't expose his own limitations as a technical leader. He closed his laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline where other companies were probably building the kinds of innovations that Novacore used to be known for. Somewhere out there, Avery was presumably dealing with her personal issues and staying out of the tech industry drama that had consumed their marriage. Jason had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, Avery Lynn was sitting in a Mission District loft, reviewing technical specifications for authentication protocols that would make Novacore's platform obsolete within 6 months. He had no idea that Maya and Ravi's departures were part of a carefully orchestrated strategy to systematically dismantle everything he thought he'd won in their divorce. But he was about to learn. The first domino had fallen, and the sound was about to echo through every aspect of Novacore's operations. Jason Cole had built his success on underestimating his ex-wife's capabilities and overestimating his own. He was about to discover how costly those miscalculations could be. Clara Martin had always prided herself on being good at her job, but 3 days into investigating Helix Labs, she was beginning to suspect that good wasn't going to be enough. She sat in her cramped cubicle at Novacore, surrounded by printouts of incorporation records, LinkedIn searches that led nowhere, and domain registration information that raised more questions than it answered. Any luck tracking down their leadership team? Jason asked, appearing at her cubicle with the kind of forced casualness that meant he was more worried than he was letting on. It's like they don't want to be found, Clara replied, gesturing at her computer screen. The company was incorporated in Delaware 3 months ago, but the registered agent is a law firm that specializes in privacy protection for startups. No public website, no press coverage, no conference appearances. The only reason we even know they exist is because clients are mentioning them in exit interviews. Jason frowned, pulling up a chair next to Clara's desk. What exactly are clients saying? That Helix offers next-generation authentication solutions with superior performance and security, that they're more responsive to technical requirements than established vendors, that their integration process is significantly simpler than current market alternatives. Clara scrolled through her notes. 3 different clients used almost identical language, which suggests either a really effective sales pitch or they actually have something that works better than what we're offering. The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to acknowledge. Jason had spent the past week telling himself that Helix Labs was just another startup trying to generate buzz with vague promises and marketing hyperbole. But clients didn't typically cite specific technical advantages unless they'd seen actual demonstrations. Have you been able to identify any of their employees? Jason asked. That's where it gets interesting, Clara said, opening a new browser tab. I found references to a CEO named Elijah Tran, but his background doesn't match the technical sophistication their clients are describing. He's an IP lawyer who left Morrison and Associates 6 months ago to start his own practice. Smart guy, solid reputation, but not exactly the profile you'd expect for a cutting-edge authentication company. Jason felt a flicker of recognition at the name, though he couldn't immediately place where he'd heard it before. What about other team members? Complete mystery. No LinkedIn profiles mentioning Helix Labs, no GitHub repositories, no technical blog posts. It's like they're operating in stealth mode, or like they're using aliases, Jason muttered, though he wasn't sure why that possibility had occurred to him. Clara was about to respond when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Clara Martin. Miss Martin? This is Noor Salat from TechCrunch. I'm working on a story about talent mobility in the San Francisco startup ecosystem, and I was hoping to get a comment from Novacor about recent departures from your engineering team. Clara felt her stomach drop. TechCrunch calling about employee departures was never good news, especially when the company was already dealing with client retention issues. Can I ask what specifically you're looking into? I'm examining patterns in how senior engineers are moving between companies, particularly in the authentication and security space. I understand that Maya Rios and Ravi Desai recently left Novacor. Both Maya and Ravi left to pursue new opportunities, Clara replied carefully. Employee transitions are normal in the tech industry, of course. Have you noticed any correlation between engineering departures and client acquisition by competitors? I'm hearing reports of a new company called Helix Labs that's been gaining traction with former Novacor clients. Clara glanced at Jason, who was listening intently to her side of the conversation. I'm not familiar with that company, she lied. But if you'd like an official statement about Novacor's growth strategy and market position, I'd be happy to schedule a more formal interview. That would be great. I'm particularly interested in how established companies like Novacor are responding to emerging competitors who claim to offer superior technical solutions. There seems to be a narrative developing about innovation versus incumbency in the authentication space. After Clara ended the call, she and Jason sat in uncomfortable silence. A TechCrunch investigation into their employee departures was bad enough, but connecting those departures to client defections and a mysterious competitor could create exactly the kind of negative publicity that would spook investors and accelerate their problems. We need to get ahead of this story, Jason said finally. Set up an interview with this Nor person. Position it as Novacor's perspective on industry innovation. Focus on our enterprise strategy and technical capabilities. Are you sure that's wise? If she's already connecting dots between our departures and client losses, an interview could give her more material to work with. Not if we control the narrative, Jason replied, though his voice lacked conviction. We tell the story of a company that's evolved beyond its startup roots, that's making strategic decisions about talent and market focus. We position the departures as natural transitions, not losses. Clara made notes, already dreading the interview preparation that would be required. Jason's confidence in his ability to control narratives had been consistently undermined by his inability to understand the technical realities underlying those narratives. Interviews with tech journalists required substance, not just spin. There's something else, Clara said hesitantly. I've been monitoring social media mentions of Novacor, and there's been an uptick in negative sentiment. Developers discussing integration challenges, security concerns, performance issues. Nothing that's reached mainstream tech coverage yet. But it's creating a perception problem in the community. Jason rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure that had become a constant presence since Ravi's resignation. Every day seemed to bring new evidence that his strategic vision for Novacor wasn't working, but admitting that would mean acknowledging failures he wasn't prepared to confront. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in the Mission District, Avery Lynn was having a very different kind of conversation about perception management. She sat in Helix Labs' main conference room with Maya, Ravi, and Elijah, reviewing the client acquisition pipeline that had grown from 0 to 12 prospects in the span of 3 weeks. TechCrunch is sniffing around, Maya reported. Noor Saleh called Clara Martin this morning asking about employee departures and competitive dynamics. She's definitely connecting Novacor's talent losses to our client gains. How much does she know? Avery asked. Not enough to identify you as the founder, but enough to recognize that something significant is happening in the authentication space. She's smart. I've read her previous pieces on startup dynamics. If we're not careful, she could uncover the whole story before we're ready to go public. Avery considered this development, weighing the risks and opportunities it presented. A premature media exposure could derail their stealth strategy, but it could also provide a platform to shape the narrative around their emergence as a Novacor competitor. What if we controlled the revelation? She suggested. Instead of letting her piece together fragments, what if we gave her the full story on our terms? Elijah looked up from the legal documents he'd been reviewing. That's a significant risk. Once your involvement becomes public, Jason will know exactly what he's facing. He'll also probably try to sue us for everything he can think of. Let him try, Avery replied with satisfaction. Everything we've done has been structured to avoid legal vulnerability. Our IP is clean, Our client acquisition has been transparent about our Novacore connections. Our employee recruiting has followed all non-compete restrictions. Jason might not like what we're doing, but he can't stop us from doing it. Ravi leaned forward. His laptop opened to technical specifications for Helix Labs' authentication protocol. There's another consideration. Our beta testing is ahead of schedule, and the results are exceptional. Performance benchmarks show authentication speeds that are 30% faster than Novacore's current platform, with security features that address every concern our former clients have raised. Meaning? Maya asked. Meaning we're not just ready to compete with Novacore, we're ready to obsolete it. If we're going to make a public move, this might be the optimal time. Avery stood and walked to the whiteboard where they'd been tracking client acquisition progress. 12 prospects had become 8 active negotiations, which had become 4 signed contracts. Not enormous numbers, but representing exactly the kind of high-quality clients that Jason was desperately trying to retain. What's our timeline for product launch? She asked. 2 weeks for general availability, Ravi replied. We could accelerate that if needed, but I'd prefer to run additional security audits before we start onboarding clients at scale. And what's our capacity for handling rapid client growth? With our current team, we could support 50 clients comfortably, maybe 75 with some infrastructure scaling. Beyond that, we'd need to hire additional engineers. Avery turned back to the group, her expression shifting into the focused intensity that had driven Novacore's early success. Here's what we're going to do. Maya, reach out to Noor Saleh directly. Tell her you're willing to provide background information for her story, but you want to make sure she understands the full context of what's happening in the authentication market. How much context? All of it. The technical limitations of Novacore's enterprise pivot, the talent exodus, the client dissatisfaction. Paint a picture of a company that lost its way when it lost its technical leadership. But don't mention Helix or me directly, let her connect those dots herself. Maya nodded, already crafting the conversation strategy in her head. And when she asks about what I'm working on now, tell her you're consulting for a stealth mode startup that's developing innovative authentication solutions. Give her just enough information to make her curious, but not enough to write a complete story. Elijah was taking notes, thinking through the legal implications of increased media scrutiny. We should also prepare for Jason's response once this becomes public. He's going to try every legal avenue he can think of, and he's going to use the media to position himself as the victim of corporate espionage or unfair competition. Good, Avery said with cold satisfaction. Let him make those arguments in public. Let him explain why the company he supposedly co-founded is losing its best talent and most important clients to a startup that didn't exist 6 months ago. Let him try to convince investors that he's the victim when he's demonstrably failed to execute on his own strategic vision. The room fell quiet as everyone processed the implications of what Avery was proposing. Going public would end the stealth phase of their operation, but it would also force a direct confrontation with Jason that would be decided in the market rather than in conference rooms or legal briefs. There's one more element to consider, Avery continued. Once we're public, we'll need to be ready for rapid scaling. That means having the infrastructure to support accelerated client acquisition, the team capacity to handle increased demand, and the financial resources to sustain growth. Are we ready for that? Elijah asked. We're about to find out, Avery replied, moving toward the door. Maya, set up the conversation with Noor for tomorrow. Ravi, prepare a technical demonstration that shows exactly why our approach is superior to Novacore's current platform. Elijah, draft a media strategy that positions us as the evolution of what authentication technology should be. As the team dispersed to execute their assignments, Avery remained in the conference room, staring out at the San Francisco skyline, where Novacore's offices occupied expensive real estate in the financial district. Jason was probably sitting in meetings right now, trying to solve problems he didn't understand with strategies that couldn't work. Soon, he would understand exactly what he'd lost when he chose to steal her company rather than support her vision. But more importantly, the rest of the industry would understand what happened when lawyers tried to run technology companies and marketers tried to replace engineers. The smoke and mirrors phase was ending. It was time for the real competition to begin. Noor Saleh had been covering Silicon Valley long enough to recognize when a story was bigger than it initially appeared. She sat in the bustling Calf and Hayes Valley, waiting for Maya Rios and reviewing the notes from her preliminary research. What had started as a routine piece about talent mobility in tech startups had evolved into something more complex, a case study in how quickly established companies could lose their competitive edge when they lost their technical leadership. Maya arrived precisely on time, carrying a laptop bag and the kind of focused energy that Noor associated with people who had important stories to tell. They settled into a corner booth where their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the other freelancers and remote workers scattered throughout the cafe. "Thanks for reaching out," Noor said, opening her notebook. "I have to admit, the more I've looked into the authentication space, the more questions I have." Novacore, losing both their head of product and their CTO within a month feels like more than coincidence. "It is more than coincidence," Maya replied directly, "but probably not in the way you think." "What do you mean?" Maya took a sip of her coffee, considering how much to reveal in this initial conversation. Avery had given her broad latitude to shape the narrative, but the goal was to guide Noor toward the truth rather than simply hand it to her. "How familiar are you with Novacore's technical architecture?" Maya asked. "I know they built a reputation for user-friendly authentication. Solutions that smaller companies could implement quickly. Simple integration, good performance, reasonable pricing. Right. And do you know what's happened to that positioning since Jason Cole took operational control?" Noor flipped through her notes. "From what I can tell, they've pivoted toward enterprise clients, bigger contracts, more complex security requirements. Standard scaling strategy for a successful startup. Except it's not working," Maya said flatly. "The enterprise pivot requires fundamental changes to their platform architecture that compromise everything that made Novacore successful. Slower performance, more complex integration, higher infrastructure costs. They're essentially trying to build a different product while maintaining the illusion that it's the same company. And that's why you left." "I left because watching brilliant technology get destroyed by strategic incompetence was making me physically ill." Ravi left because Jason kept asking him to implement features that were technically impossible with their current codebase. "The engineering team is hemorrhaging talent because no one wants to work for a CEO who makes promises he can't keep to clients who don't understand what they're buying." Noor was taking rapid notes, recognizing the broader narrative that was emerging. "So the talent departures aren't just about individual career moves, they're about fundamental disagreements with the company's direction. They're about people who understand technology refusing to participate in its destruction," Maya corrected. "Jason Cole is a lawyer who thinks he can run a tech company because he learned to speak the language of venture capital. But speaking the language isn't the same as understanding the substance." "What about Avery Lynn?" "I know she's been out of the picture since the divorce, but she was the original technical founder. Any insight into her perspective on these changes?" Maya paused, weighing her response carefully. This was the moment where she could begin guiding Noor toward the revelation that would reframe the entire story. Avery built Novacore from nothing because she saw problems in how authentication systems handled user experience and security. She spent 3 years proving that those problems could be solved without compromising either performance or accessibility. Maya's voice carried genuine admiration mixed with carefully controlled anger. Watching Jason systematically undo that work in service of his enterprise growth fantasies would be devastating for anyone, but especially for someone who sacrificed their marriage to build something meaningful. Sacrificed their marriage? Jason used the divorce proceedings to position himself as an equal partner in a company he'd never truly contributed to. He leveraged Avery's trust and their shared history to claim credit for work he didn't do and vision he didn't understand. Then he immediately began changing everything that made the company successful. Noor felt the familiar excitement that came with recognizing a story that was much larger than she'd anticipated. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a verifiable fact. Look at Novacore's technical roadmap before and after the divorce. Look at their client satisfaction scores, their employee retention rates, their competitive positioning. Everything that made the company innovative and sustainable has been systematically dismantled in favor of short-term revenue strategies that don't actually work. And meanwhile, there are rumors about new competitors emerging in the authentication space." Maya smiled for the first time during their conversation. "There are always new competitors emerging. The question is whether they understand the market well enough to build something better than what exists. Companies like Helix Labs. I wouldn't know. I'm just a consultant now, helping people think through technical challenges in the authentication space." Noor studied Maya's expression, recognizing the careful non-denial that confirmed her suspicions. What kind of consulting are you doing? The kind that helps innovative companies solve problems that established players can't or won't address. Performance optimization, security architecture, user experience design. The fundamentals that made authentication technology accessible to smaller organizations in the first place. For clients who are dissatisfied with their current authentication providers. For clients who need solutions that actually work, Maya replied, which increasingly means clients who've discovered that enterprise-focused platforms can't deliver the simplicity and reliability they were promised, nor was beginning to understand the broader competitive dynamic that was emerging. Novacore's enterprise pivot was creating market opportunities for competitors who could deliver what established companies no longer offered. And Maya's careful responses suggested that those competitors were closer to reality than industry gossip indicated. If I wanted to understand more about these emerging alternatives, Noor said, where would you suggest I look? I'd suggest talking to former Novacore clients who've switched to other platforms. Ask them what they were looking for that they couldn't get from an established vendor. Ask them about performance requirements, integration complexity, security features. Ask them whether the solutions they found were built by people who actually understand the technology. Any specific companies I should research? Maya was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. There's someone you should meet. Someone who's been thinking about authentication challenges longer and more deeply than almost anyone in the industry. Someone who might be able to give you perspective on what next-generation solutions actually look like. Who? Give me your number. I'll arrange an introduction, but it'll need to be on her terms. She's been through enough media attention to last a lifetime, so any conversation would need to be substantive and respectful. Noor provided her contact information, already suspecting who Maya was referring to but not wanting to voice the assumption prematurely. If Avery Lynn was involved in developing competitive authentication solutions, it would transform this story from an industry trend piece into a narrative about revenge, redemption, and the power dynamics that shape Silicon Valley's most successful companies. After Maya left, Noor spent the rest of the afternoon researching incorporation records, patent filings, and technical publications related to authentication security. The picture that emerged was fascinating and slightly unsettling: a web of stealth mode development, strategic talent acquisition, and competitive positioning that suggested someone with deep industry knowledge was systematically dismantling Novacore's market position. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Avery Lynn. Maya suggested we should talk. Are you free tomorrow evening for coffee? I have some thoughts about authentication technology that might interest you. Noor stared at the message, feeling the same excitement she'd experienced early in her career, when she'd stumbled onto stories that no one else was tracking. This wasn't just about talent mobility or competitive dynamics. This was about what happened when someone who'd been systematically underestimated decided to prove exactly what they were capable of. Meanwhile, across the city in Novacore's conference room, Jason Cole was having his own conversation with a journalist, though his was considerably less productive. He sat across from a business reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, trying to explain Novacore's strategic evolution without acknowledging any of the problems that evolution had created. Our enterprise focus represents a natural maturation of our platform, Jason said, gesturing toward charts that showed revenue growth without mentioning client retention issues. We're moving beyond the startup ecosystem to serve organizations with serious security requirements and substantial technology budgets. But you've lost some key technical personnel recently, the reporter noted. Maya Rios and Ravi Desai were both significant contributors to your product development. How does their departure affect your technical capabilities? All companies experience employee transitions, Jason replied with practiced casualness. Maya and Ravi made valuable contributions during their time here, but Novacore's technical foundation is strong enough to support continued innovation and growth. Are you concerned about new competitors entering the authentication market? I've been hearing rumors about emerging companies that claim to offer superior technical solutions. Jason felt his jaw tighten slightly. The authentication space is always evolving, and new companies regularly attempt to challenge established players. But building sustainable authentication solutions requires more than technical innovation. It requires deep understanding of enterprise security requirements, regulatory compliance, and scalable business models. Companies like Helix Labs? The name hit Jason like a physical blow, though he worked to keep his expression neutral. I'm not familiar with that specific company, but as I said, new competitors emerge regularly. Most fail to gain significant market traction, even when they're founded by experienced industry veterans. Experience is valuable, but execution is what matters. Novacore has a 3-year track record of delivering reliable authentication solutions to hundreds of clients. That's not easily replicated by startups with untested platforms and unproven business models, but even as Jason spoke the words, he felt their inadequacy. The conversation with the Chronicle reporter was supposed to reinforce Novacore's market position, but instead it was highlighting vulnerabilities he'd been trying to ignore. The questions about Helix Labs were particularly concerning if reporters were asking about specific competitors. It meant those competitors were generating enough industry attention to warrant investigation. After the interview, Jason retreated to his office and immediately called Clara. I need everything you can find about Helix Labs by tomorrow morning. Incorporation records, patent filings, employee profiles, client lists, whatever it takes. I've been trying, Claire replied, frustration evident in her voice. But they're incredibly well protected legally. Every search hits privacy barriers or legal firewalls. It's like they were designed specifically to avoid detection, then find another angle. Talk to clients who've mentioned them, research their technical claims, identify their funding sources. Someone that organized doesn't emerge from nowhere. As Jason ended the call, he walked to his office window and stared out at the San Francisco skyline. Somewhere in the city, competitors were apparently building solutions that threatened everything he'd worked to establish at Novacore. The thought that Avery might be involved crossed his mind briefly, but he dismissed it almost immediately. She was dealing with personal issues, taking time away from the tech industry to heal from their divorce. Jason Cole had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, Avery Lynn was sitting in a Mission District cafe, explaining to one of Silicon Valley's most respected tech journalists exactly how authentication technology should work and why Novacore's current approach was fundamentally flawed. He had no idea that tomorrow's conversation would be the beginning of the end of his control over the company he thought he'd won. The reveal was coming, and Jason wasn't prepared for what it would expose about his leadership, his technical understanding, or his ex-wife's capacity for strategic thinking. But he was about to learn. Jason Cole was drinking his second cup of coffee and scanning TechCrunch's morning headlines when he saw it. The article title appeared innocuous enough, The Authentication Wars, How Technical Vision Shapes Competitive Advantage. But as he clicked through to the full piece, his coffee grew cold and his hands began to shake. In the rapidly evolving landscape of authentication technology, few stories illustrate the importance of technical leadership as clearly as the tale of two companies, one that lost its way when it lost its founder, and another that emerged from the shadows to reclaim what innovation actually looks like. The article, written by Noor Salah, was a masterclass in narrative journalism that systematically dismantled everything Jason thought he understood about his position in the market. But it wasn't until the third paragraph that the true scope of his miscalculation became clear. Avery Lynn built Novacore Technologies from her Stanford dorm room, creating an authentication platform that balanced security with simplicity in ways that established enterprise solutions couldn't match. Her technical vision drove 3 years of consistent growth and industry recognition. Then came the divorce that would change everything, not just for Lynn, but for the entire authentication market. Jason's vision blurred as he continued reading. The article chronicled Novacore's decline in forensic detail, client retention dropping 40%, engineering talent exodus, strategic pivot failures, performance degradation. But worse than the catalog of his failures was the revelation of what had been happening while he'd assumed Avery was healing from their divorce, while Novacore struggled with the transition from founder-led innovation to executive-managed operations. A stealth competitor was emerging in the Mission District. Helix Labs, founded and led by Lynn herself, has been quietly developing next-generation authentication solutions that address every limitation of current market offerings, including those of her former company. The phone in Jason's hand slipped and clattered onto his desk. He read the paragraph 3 times before the reality penetrated his shock. Avery hadn't been taking time off to process their divorce. She'd been building his replacement. The article continued with technical details that made Jason's inadequacy painfully obvious. Performance benchmarks showing Helix Labs' authentication speeds 30% faster than Novacore's current platform. Security features that addressed every concern clients had raised about enterprise authentication requirements. Integration processes that required half the implementation time of existing solutions, but the most devastating section came near the end, where Noor had included direct quotes from Avery's interview. Authentication technology should serve users, not vendors, Lynn explained during our conversation at a Mission District CAF, her first public comments since leaving Novacore. When companies prioritize revenue growth over user experience, they inevitably compromise the very innovations that made them successful. We built Helix Labs to prove that technical excellence and business success aren't mutually exclusive, they're interdependent. Asked about her departure from Novacore, Lynn was characteristically direct. I spent 3 years building something meaningful, only to watch it get dismantled by someone who confused legal ownership with technical understanding. Rather than fight for control of a company that no longer represented my values, I decided to build something better. Jason's phone was buzzing with notifications, missed calls from board members, text messages from investors, Slack alerts from employees who were probably reading the same article. But he couldn't focus on anything except the final quote that Noor had included. The best revenge isn't destroying what someone took from you, it's proving they never deserved it in the first place. The conference room filled quickly once Jason managed to summon the executive team for an emergency meeting. Clara arrived first, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and her expression suggesting she'd already seen the article. The engineering team filed in next, led by interim CTO Sarah Kim, who'd been promoted after Ravi's departure despite having half his experience and none of his strategic vision. I assume everyone's seen the TechCrunch piece, Jason said, his voice carrying forced authority that fooled no one. I want to discuss our response strategy. Our response strategy to what exactly? Asked Tom Bradley, the VP of sales who'd been fielding increasingly difficult questions from clients for the past month. To the fact that our founder has been building a direct competitor while we've been hemorrhaging talent and clients? Or to the fact that apparently everyone in the industry knows about it except us? Avery is entitled to start a new company, Jason replied stiffly. That doesn't change Novacore's market position or technical capabilities, doesn't it? Sarah Kim opened her laptop and pulled up Helix Labs' technical specifications, which had been published alongside the TechCrunch article. These performance benchmarks are 30% better than what we're currently delivering. Their security architecture addresses every limitation our enterprise clients have complained about. And their integration process is simpler than our original platform, the one we've been complicating for the past 6 months. Clara was scrolling through social media on her phone, her face growing paler with each refresh. It's not just TechCrunch. The story's being picked up by every major tech publication. Hacker News has it on the front page with 800 comments. Twitter's full of developers saying they're not surprised that Avery was the real technical talent behind Novacore. What are clients saying? Jason asked. Though he dreaded the answer, Tom consulted his own phone, which had been vibrating continuously for the past hour. 3 of our largest enterprise clients have requested immediate meetings to discuss their evolving authentication requirements. 2 startups have already sent termination notices citing performance concerns that need to be addressed urgently. And the Techstars portfolio companies are asking pointed questions about our technical roadmap and leadership stability. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Jason had spent months positioning himself as the stable, experienced leader who could guide Novacore through its maturation from startup to enterprise company. The TechCrunch article had exposed that narrative as fundamentally false. He wasn't the experienced leader, he was the lawyer who'd manipulated his way into controlling something he'd never understood. We need a comprehensive response plan, Jason said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Clara, I want you to prepare a statement emphasizing Novacore's established market position, our proven track record, our client relationships. Position this as exactly what it is: a new competitor making unsubstantiated claims about unproven technology. Unsubstantiated claims? Sarah Kim looked up from her laptop with an expression of barely controlled frustration. Jason, I've reviewed their technical documentation. Their authentication protocol is genuinely innovative. Their performance metrics are based on independently verified benchmarks. And their security architecture incorporates advances that we've been talking about implementing for months but haven't been able to prioritize because of the enterprise pivot requirements. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe we should stop pretending this is a marketing problem and start acknowledging that it's a technical one. Avery Lynn built Novacore's original platform, and now she's built something better. Our clients aren't going to stay loyal just because we have incumbent advantage if we can't deliver equivalent capabilities. Jason felt his authority slipping away with each exchange. The uncomfortable truth that no one was willing to state directly was becoming impossible to ignore. Avery had always been the technical vision behind Novacore, and her departure had left the company without the expertise needed to innovate or even maintain their competitive position. What about legal options? He asked, turning to the company's general counsel, who'd been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting. Limited, came the reply. Our legal team reviewed all departure documentation when Maya and Ravi left, and everything appears to have been handled correctly. No non-compete violations, no intellectual property theft, no breach of fiduciary duty. Helix Labs was incorporated properly. Their technology appears to be independently developed, and their client acquisition has been transparent about their Novacore connections. But surely there's something, Jason, Clara interrupted gently. Maybe the question isn't what legal options we have. Maybe the question is what business options we have. The words hung in the air, carrying implications that everyone understood, but no one wanted to articulate. Novacore's competitive position had been fundamentally compromised, not by corporate espionage or unfair business practices, but by the simple reality that their former technical leader had built something better than what they could offer. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations about damage control and client retention strategies, Jason retreated to his office and closed the door. The San Francisco skyline outside his window looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything else had changed. The company he'd thought he'd won in the divorce was revealed as a hollow shell without the person who'd given it substance. The strategic vision he'd been pursuing was exposed as technically impossible. The narrative he'd constructed about his own leadership was crumbling under scrutiny from people who actually understood the technology. His phone buzzed with a text from Jordan Malik. Emergency board call in 30 minutes. We need to discuss the company's response to recent developments. Jason stared at the message, knowing that recent developments was diplomatic language for the complete exposure of your incompetence as a technical leader. The board had supported his enterprise pivot strategy because they'd trusted his assessment of market opportunities and competitive dynamics. Now they would discover that his assessments had been based on assumptions rather than analysis, confidence rather than capability. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in the Mission District, Avery Lynn was sitting in Helix Labs' conference room, watching real-time analytics that showed their website traffic increasing by 400% since the TechCrunch article went live. Her phone had been buzzing continuously with interview requests, client inquiries, and investor outreach, but she'd turned off notifications to focus on the strategic decisions that would determine whether this moment of attention translated into sustainable business growth. 12 new client inquiries in the past 2 hours, Maya reported, scrolling through their inbound lead pipeline, including 3 Fortune 500 companies that specifically mentioned reading about our technical capabilities in the TechCrunch piece. What about former Novacore clients? Avery asked. 6 companies have reached out asking about migration timelines. They're not just interested in switching, they're asking how quickly we can implement solutions that address the performance issues they've been experiencing with Novacore's recent updates. Ravi looked up from his laptop, where he'd been monitoring industry forums and social media discussions about the article. The developer community response has been overwhelmingly positive. People are saying they're not surprised that you were the real technical talent behind Novacore, and they're excited to see what you can build without corporate constraints. Any negative reactions? Avery asked. Some Novacore defenders arguing that platform stability matters more than innovation, but they're being drowned out by developers sharing their own experiences with Novacore's recent performance issues. The consensus seems to be that this explains why Novacore's quality has declined since the divorce. Elijah entered the conference room carrying a folder full of legal documents and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose careful planning had proven effective. I've been monitoring for any legal challenges from Novacore, but so far nothing. Their general counsel would have a hard time arguing that we've done anything improper, since we've been scrupulous about following all legal requirements. What about patent issues? Maya asked. Our IP is completely clean. Every algorithm and protocol we've developed builds on publicly available research and our own innovations. Novacore can't claim ownership of general authentication concepts, and they certainly can't prevent Avery from continuing to work in the field she pioneered. Avery stood and walked to the whiteboard where they'd been tracking their progress since the company's founding. 3 months ago, Helix Labs had been nothing more than an idea and a legal framework. Now they had a functional product, a growing client base, and industry recognition as the legitimate evolution of what Novacore should have become. Here's what happens next, she said, turning back to the group. We scale responsibly. We prioritize client success over rapid growth. We maintain the technical excellence that differentiates us from enterprise-focused competitors. And we prove that sustainable innovation comes from understanding problems, not from managing narratives. As her team dispersed to handle the flood of opportunities that the TechCrunch article had generated, Avery remained in the conference room, staring out at the city where Jason was probably dealing with the consequences of his strategic miscalculations. She felt no satisfaction in his pain, no pleasure in his professional humiliation, but she felt deep fulfillment in the knowledge that technical excellence had prevailed over legal manipulation, that substance had triumphed over spin. Jason Cole had used their marriage to steal half of her company, but he'd never understood what made that company valuable, and his attempts to improve it had only proven how little he comprehended about the technology he'd claimed to co-create. Now the market would decide which approach to authentication technology actually served users' needs, and Avery Lynn was confident about the outcome of that competition. The Moscone Center's West building buzzed with the energy of 3,000 software developers, venture capitalists, and tech executives gathered for the annual Authentication and Security Summit. Avery Lynn stood backstage, adjusting her wireless microphone and reviewing the final slides of her keynote presentation. 6 months ago, she'd been sitting in a divorce lawyer's office watching Jason claim half of her life's work. Today she was about to address the largest gathering of authentication industry professionals in North America. 5 minutes to showtime, the stage manager announced, clipboard in hand and headset crackling with technical coordination chatter. Avery nodded, taking a deep breath as she looked through the curtain at the packed auditorium. The front rows were filled with faces she recognized: former clients, current competitors, industry analysts who'd been tracking Helix Labs' meteoric rise since the TechCrunch article had transformed them from stealth startup to market disruptor. Somewhere in the audience, she knew, were executives from Novacore, probably sent to monitor what their former founder would reveal about the competitive landscape they were struggling to navigate. You're going to kill it, Maya said, appearing at Avery's elbow with a tablet displaying real-time social media monitoring. Twitter's already buzzing about your presentation, and we haven't even started yet. Any word from the team about the morning client calls? Avery asked, Ravis handling the technical deep dive with that Fortune 500 financial services company. Elijah's walking through integration timelines with the healthcare startup from Boston. We're officially at capacity for Q1 onboarding, which is a good problem to have. The stage manager gestured toward the wings. Miss Lynn, you're on. Avery walked onto the stage to sustained applause, stepping up to the podium with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. The slides behind her displayed the Helix Labs logo, clean, modern, technically sophisticated without being ostentatious. Everything Novacore's recent rebranding wasn't. Good morning, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. I want to start with a simple question. What if everything we think we know about scaling authentication technology is wrong? The audience quieted, attention focusing on the woman who'd become Silicon Valley's most talked about comeback story. Avery clicked to her first slide, displaying performance metrics that had become legendary in developer forums: authentication speeds that outperformed existing solutions by margins previously thought impossible. 6 months ago, I thought my role in the authentication industry was over, she continued. I'd built a company, watched it grow, then watched it get systematically dismantled by someone who confused legal ownership with technical understanding. I could have spent my time fighting for control of something that no longer represented my values. Instead, I decided to prove that technical excellence doesn't require corporate politics, it requires focus, discipline, and respect for the problems we're trying to solve. The presentation that followed was part technical demonstration, part business case study, and part philosophical manifesto about what technology companies owed their users. Avery walked through Helix Labs' approach to authentication security, explaining how they'd achieved performance gains by rethinking fundamental assumptions about how authentication systems should be architected. The conventional wisdom says, you have to choose between security and speed, between enterprise features and user experience, between innovation and stability, she said, advancing to a slide that showed side-by-side comparisons with major authentication providers. We rejected those false choices and built something that delivers all of the above. The audience was engaged in ways that conference keynotes rarely achieved. Developers were taking notes on technical details, executives were calculating implementation costs, and venture capitalists were probably composing investment inquiry emails on their phones. But the most meaningful reactions came from the industry veterans who understood exactly what Avery was demonstrating, that incremental improvements weren't enough anymore, that the authentication market was ready for fundamental innovation. Building Helix Labs taught me something important about failure and recovery, Avery continued, moving into the section of her presentation that had attracted the most advanced publicity. When someone takes something from you, whether it's credit for your work, control of your company, or ownership of your vision, you have two choices. You can spend your energy trying to get it back, or you can spend your energy building something better. She clicked to a slide showing Helix Labs' growth trajectory, client acquisition, performance metrics, industry recognition, team expansion. The numbers told a story of sustainable success built on technical merit rather than marketing hyperbole. We chose to build something better, not to prove a point, not to get revenge, but because the problems we solve matter too much to let them be compromised by ego or politics. Authentication security affects every digital interaction in the modern economy. Users deserve solutions that work, not solutions that sound impressive in board meetings. The presentation concluded with Avery's vision for the future of authentication. Technology open standards, privacy-first design, performance optimization that didn't compromise security features. As she fielded questions from the audience, the conversations revealed how thoroughly Helix Labs had shifted industry expectations about what authentication platforms could deliver. How do you respond to critics who say that Helix Labs' success is based more on your personal story than your technical capabilities? Asked a questioner from the back of the auditorium. I'd suggest they try our platform, Avery replied with a slight smile. Personal stories don't reduce authentication latency by 30% or improve security audit results. Technical innovation does. We're happy to be judged on our results rather than our narrative. After the presentation, Avery was surrounded by a crowd of industry professionals wanting to discuss partnerships, implementation strategies, and technical details. She worked through the conversations with practiced efficiency, but her attention was caught by a familiar figure hovering at the edge of the group, Jordan Malik, the venture capitalist who'd been on Novacore's board since their Series A funding. Impressive presentation, Jordan said when the crowd finally thinned enough for private conversation. I have to admit, when I first heard about Helix Labs, I assumed it was going to be a revenge project that would burn out after the initial publicity. I was wrong. Revenge projects don't scale, Avery replied. They're built on emotion instead of substance, and they collapse as soon as the emotional energy dissipates. We built Helix Labs to solve problems, not to settle scores, and yet you've systematically captured every market segment that Novacore has struggled to serve effectively. We've focused on delivering what users actually need instead of what executives think they want to buy. It turns out those are different things. Jordan nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to discuss investment opportunities. Meridian Ventures is particularly interested in companies that demonstrate both technical innovation and sustainable business models. From what I've seen, Helix Labs qualifies on both counts. We're not actively fundraising, Avery said, though she didn't close the door entirely. But I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on market opportunities that might require additional capital to pursue effectively. They exchanged contact information, and Jordan departed with the satisfied expression of someone who'd identified a potentially lucrative investment opportunity. Avery made her way toward the conference exit, where Maya and Ravi were waiting. with tablets full of notes from the industry conversations they'd been monitoring throughout her presentation. "How many interview requests?" Avery asked as they walked toward the parking garage. 14, including Forbes, Wired, and the Wall Street Journal, Maya replied. "Plus 3 podcast requests and an invitation to keynote the European Security Conference in London next month." Client inquiries? 27 qualified leads, including 6 companies that specifically mentioned your presentation as the reason they're considering switching authentication providers. Ravi looked up from his tablet, where he'd been tracking social media responses to clips from Avery's keynote. The developer community reaction has been overwhelmingly positive. People are sharing your quotes about technical excellence versus corporate politics, and there's a lot of discussion about how Helix Labs represents what Novacore should have become. As they reached their cars, Avery's phone buzzed with a notification she'd been expecting but dreading. A news alert from TechCrunch. Novacore Technologies announces strategic restructuring. CEO Jason Cole steps down. She opened the article and read the first few paragraphs aloud. Novacore Technologies, once a rising star in the authentication security space, announced today that CEO Jason Cole will be stepping down to pursue other opportunities following a challenging quarter, marked by client departures and competitive pressures. The company's board cited the need for technical leadership that aligns with market demands as the driving factor behind the leadership change. Maya whistled softly. 6 months from divorce papers to competitor's CEO resignation. That might be a Silicon Valley record. "It's not about Jason," Avery said, though she couldn't entirely suppress her satisfaction at the news. "It's about proving that substance matters more than narrative, that technical competence can't be faked or manipulated or stolen through legal proceedings." "Still," Ravi added with a grin, "it's a pretty satisfying validation of everything we've been working toward." Avery drove back to the Mission District through afternoon traffic, reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed since that cold morning in the Montgomery Tower when she'd signed divorce papers that gave Jason half of her company. She'd thought that was the end of her story as a tech founder. Instead, it had been the beginning of something better, a company built on the principles she'd always believed in, staffed by people who shared her commitment to technical excellence, serving clients who valued innovation over corporate politics. The Helix Labs office was buzzing with activity when she arrived. The engineering team was conducting code reviews for their next platform release. The business development team was scheduling client onboarding sessions, and Elijah was coordinating with their legal and accounting teams to handle the operational complexity that came with rapid growth. "How did the keynote go?" asked Sarah Chen, one of the senior engineers they'd recruited from a struggling enterprise software company that had been acquired and dismantled by a larger corporation. "Well enough that we're going to need to accelerate our hiring timeline," Avery replied. "Maya's got a list of qualified leads that would double our client base, but we'll need additional engineering capacity to serve them effectively." "Good problem to have," Sarah said. "Though I have to ask, any regrets about not trying to fight for Novacore instead of starting over?" Avery considered the question, looking around at the office space they'd transformed from an empty art collective loft into a thriving technology company. The walls were covered with technical diagrams, user experience flow charts, and performance benchmarks that told the story of a team focused on solving problems rather than managing perceptions. "None," she said finally. Fighting for Novacore would have meant accepting that Jason's approach to running technology companies was legitimate, that legal manipulation was an acceptable substitute for technical competence. Building Helix Labs meant proving that it wasn't. As evening settled over San Francisco, Avery sat in her office reviewing the strategic plan that would guide Helix Labs through their next phase of growth. International expansion, enterprise partnerships, open source initiatives that would help establish industry standards around authentication security. The possibilities seemed limitless, bounded only by their commitment to maintaining the technical excellence that had distinguished them from competitors who prioritized marketing over engineering. Her laptop chimed with an email from an unexpected source, a young woman named Jennifer Liu who'd just graduated from Stanford with a computer science degree and was looking for her first job in tech. The message was brief but struck a chord. "Miss Lin, I heard your keynote presentation today and wanted to thank you for showing that technical innovation doesn't require compromising your values. I'm a first-generation Chinese American who's been told that success in Silicon Valley requires playing politics and managing perceptions. Your example with Helix Labs proves that excellence speaks for itself. Would you be interested in mentoring someone who wants to build technology that actually matters? Avery stared at the email for a long moment, remembering her own early days in the tech industry when she'd been hungry for examples of people who'd succeeded by solving real problems rather than by navigating corporate hierarchies. She'd found a few mentors along the way, but not as many as she'd needed. She began typing her response, "Jennifer, I'd be happy to discuss mentorship opportunities. More importantly, I'd be interested in hearing about the problems you think technology should be solving." Sometimes the best innovations come from people who haven't been told what's impossible yet. Outside her office window, the lights of San Francisco sparkled against the bay, and somewhere in the city, Jason Cole was probably packing up his belongings from the office that had once been hers. But Avery Lynn was no longer looking backward. She was building the future, one line of code and one satisfied client at a time. And the future looked very promising indeed. 1 year later, Avery Lynn stood on the rooftop terrace of Helix Labs' new headquarters in Soma, watching the sunset paint the San Francisco Bay in shades of gold and amber. The building, a renovated 1,922 warehouse with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, housed a team of 48 engineers, designers, and business professionals who'd help transform her vision of ethical authentication technology into an industry-changing reality. The government contracts came through, Maya announced, joining Avery at the terrace railing with 2 cups of coffee and a tablet displaying the latest client acquisition metrics. Department of Education, Health and Human Services, and Veterans Affairs. They want to standardize on our privacy-first authentication protocols for all citizen-facing digital services. Avery accepted the coffee gratefully, still processing the magnitude of what Maya had just described. Government adoption meant more than revenue. It meant that Helix Labs' approach to authentication security would become the baseline for how millions of Americans interacted with federal services. Their commitment to user privacy and technical excellence wasn't just a competitive advantage anymore. It was becoming a public standard. "What's the timeline for implementation?" she asked. 18 months for full deployment across all 3 agencies. Ravi's already started building out the infrastructure team we'll need to support that scale. And Elijah's coordinating with their compliance teams to make sure we exceed every security requirement they can imagine. Any word from the Ethics Reform Committee? Maya consulted her tablet, scrolling through updates from the congressional subcommittee that had been investigating data privacy practices in the tech industry. Senator Williams wants to use Helix Labs as a case study for how technology companies can prioritize user rights without sacrificing business viability. She's asking if you'd be willing to testify about sustainable innovation practices at next month's hearing. Avery nodded thoughtfully. 6 months ago, she'd been invited to participate in policy discussions about tech industry regulation, a role that had evolved naturally from her public advocacy for user-centered design principles. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being asked to help shape the regulatory environment that would govern the industry Jason had tried to manipulate through legal maneuvering and corporate politics. "Schedule it," she said, "but I want to focus on positive examples rather than regulatory threats. The goal should be encouraging innovation that serves users, not punishing companies for past mistakes." They were interrupted by the arrival of Noor Saleh, who'd been granted exclusive access to Helix Labs for a follow-up feature article that would chronicle the company's evolution from stealth startup to industry leader. Noor carried her notebook and the same sharp curiosity that had made her initial investigation so devastating to Jason's credibility. "Mind if I join you?" Noor asked. "The view from up here is spectacular, and I wanted to ask about the long-term vision for Helix Labs." "Of course," Avery replied, gesturing toward the outdoor seating area where several employees were finishing late afternoon meetings under the California sun. "What specifically are you curious about?" "A year ago, this company was essentially a revenge project, brilliant, strategically sound, but motivated by what Jason Cole had taken from you. Now you're setting industry standards, influencing government policy, and mentoring the next generation of tech founders. What drove that evolution?" Avery considered the question, watching a container ship navigate toward the port of Oakland. While tech shuttles carried workers between Silicon Valley and San Francisco, The city below represented everything ambitious and problematic about the technology industry: innovation and exploitation, democratization and concentration of power, solutions and unintended consequences. Revenge has a natural endpoint, she said finally. Once you've proven your point, once you've demonstrated that the person who wronged you didn't deserve what they took, what's left? You can spend your life nursing grievances, or you can spend it building something meaningful, and building something meaningful requires understanding that individual success is hollow unless it contributes to something larger. Helix Labs works because we've focused on solving problems that matter to millions of people, not just problems that matter to venture capitalists or corporate executives. Maya pulled up a presentation on her tablet showing statistics that had become central to Helix Labs' identity: authentication security for over 2 million users, with privacy protection protocols that exceeded industry standards and performance metrics that had forced competitors to fundamentally rethink their approaches. The numbers tell part of the story, Maya added, but the culture tells the rest. We've proven that ethical business practices and technical excellence aren't just compatible, they're mutually reinforcing. Noor was taking notes in her precise handwriting, occasionally looking up to observe the interactions between Helix Labs employees who'd gathered on the terrace for their weekly team meeting. The atmosphere was markedly different from the corporate environments that dominated Silicon Valley: more collaborative, less hierarchical, focused on technical merit rather than political maneuvering. What about Jason Cole? Noor asked. I know he's no longer involved with Novacore, but have you had any contact since the company's restructuring? None, Avery replied without hesitation. And I hope to keep it that way. Jason represents an approach to business that prioritizes extraction over creation, manipulation over innovation. Engaging with that approach would be counterproductive for everyone involved. Do you know what he's doing now? Maya and Avery exchanged glances, and Maya pulled up another tab on her tablet. Last I heard, he'd moved to Portland and was working as a consultant for small law firms that need help with technology contracts. Apparently, his experience with startup legal issues makes him valuable to lawyers who don't understand the tech industry. Ironic, Noor observed. He went from claiming to be a technology visionary to actually being what he always was: a lawyer who knows enough about tech to translate between industries. It's not ironic, Avery corrected gently. It's appropriate. Jason's skills have value when applied to problems he actually understands. The damage happened when he tried to apply those skills to problems that required technical expertise he didn't possess. As the conversation continued, other Helix Labs employees joined them on the terrace, creating the kind of informal knowledge sharing that had become central to the company's culture. Ravi discussed infrastructure challenges with the new senior engineers, Elijah reviewed partnership opportunities with the business development team, and Sarah Chen walked through user experience improvements with the design team. This is what sustainable innovation looks like, Avery explained to Noor. Decisions made by people who understand the problems they're solving, accountability to users rather than just shareholders, and success measured by impact rather than just revenue. And it's scalable? Noor asked. We're about to find out, Maya replied with a grin. Next quarter we're opening offices in London and Singapore, plus research partnerships with universities in 3 countries. If our approach works at that scale, it could reshape how the global tech industry thinks about business ethics. As evening settled over the city, the rooftop gradually cleared except for Avery, Maya, and Noor, who was finishing her interview with questions about Avery's advice for other founders who'd experienced betrayal or setbacks in their entrepreneurial journeys. What would you tell someone who's in the position you were in a year ago? Noor asked. Someone whose business partner has manipulated them out of control of their own company. Avery was quiet for a moment, thinking about the emails she'd been receiving from entrepreneurs who'd read about her story and were seeking guidance about their own situations. The common thread was always the same: talented people who'd been outmaneuvered by partners who prioritize control over competence. I'd tell them that fighting for something that's been compromised is usually less productive than building something better, she said. Not because justice doesn't matter, but because the energy required to reclaim what was taken could be better spent creating what should exist, even when that means starting over completely. Especially when that means starting over completely. Starting over forces you to question every assumption, to rebuild from first principles, to create something that reflects your values rather than something that accommodates someone else's limitations. Noor made her final notes and prepared to leave, but she paused at the terrace door with one last question. What's the headline for tomorrow's story? What's the most important thing readers should understand about what Helix Labs represents? Avery looked out at the city lights beginning to flicker on across San Francisco and the peninsula, thinking about the thousands of people who would interact with their authentication technology the next day, the government services that would be more secure and more private because of their work, the other entrepreneurs who might be inspired to prioritize ethics over expedience. She didn't just rebuild, Avery said finally. She redefined the game. After Noor left, Avery and Maya remained on the terrace, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The building below them was still active with engineers working late to solve complex problems, business development managers coordinating with international clients, and support staff ensuring that their platform continued to deliver the reliability their users had come to expect. Notification for you, Maya said, glancing at her phone. Jennifer Liu sent her quarterly update from the mentorship program. Avery smiled, remembering the eager Stanford graduate who'd reached out after her keynote presentation. Jennifer had become the first participant in Helix Labs' formal mentorship initiative, which had since expanded to support 15 young entrepreneurs who were committed to building technology that served users rather than exploited them. How's her startup progressing? She's raising seed funding for a platform that helps small businesses implement data privacy protections. 3 potential investors, all of whom specifically mentioned your recommendation as a factor in their interest. Good. The industry needs more people who understand that privacy protection and business success aren't mutually exclusive. Maya's phone buzzed with another notification, this one from their legal team. Elijah wants to know if you're available tomorrow morning to review the open-source licensing framework for our authentication protocols. Apparently, several major companies are asking about implementing our approach in their own platforms. Schedule it, Avery replied. But I want to make sure the licensing terms prioritize user benefit over corporate convenience. If other companies want to use our innovations, they need to commit to the same privacy standards we've established. As they prepared to leave the rooftop, Avery's phone chimed with a message that made her pause. The notification showed a LinkedIn connection request from someone whose name she recognized but hadn't expected to hear from, Tom Bradley, the former VP of sales at Novacore who'd been caught in the middle of Jason's strategic failures. The message was brief. Avery, I wanted to reach out to congratulate you on Helix Labs' success and to apologize for not speaking up more forcefully about the problems I saw developing at Novacore. I've learned a lot about leadership and integrity from watching how you've built your new company. If you're ever hiring experienced sales professionals who share your commitment to ethical business practices, I'd be honored to be considered. Avery showed the message to Maya, who whistled softly in recognition. That's interesting. Tom was one of the few people at Novacore who seemed to understand that Jason's enterprise pivot was destroying client relationships. And he stayed until the end trying to make it work, Avery noted. That shows both loyalty and resilience. Are you going to respond? Avery considered the question, thinking about Helix Labs' expansion plans and the kind of people they needed to support sustainable growth. The company's success had been built on technical excellence, but scaling would require sales professionals who could communicate that excellence to clients without overselling capabilities or compromising values. I'll set up a conversation, she decided, not necessarily about immediate hiring, but about what ethical sales practices look like in the tech industry. If he's genuinely committed to that approach, we might have opportunities down the line. As they rode the elevator down to the main floor, Maya reflected on how much had changed since they'd first met in that Mission District cafe to discuss the possibility of competing with Novacore. A year ago, we were planning to poach Jason's clients and employees. Now we're getting applications from people who want to work for a company that represents their values. That's the difference between revenge and vision, Avery replied. Revenge is about taking something away from someone who wronged you. Vision is about building something so compelling that people choose to be part of it. They walked through the Helix Labs office, saying goodnight to the engineers who were still debugging code and the customer support team that was handling inquiries from clients in different time zones. The space hummed with the productive energy of people who believed in the work they were doing, who understood that their technical decisions affected real users' security and privacy. "One more thing," Maya said as they reached the exit. "Jennifer, Liu asked if you'd be interested in speaking at a Stanford event about entrepreneurship and ethics. Apparently, her professor thinks your story would be valuable for students who are thinking about startup careers." Avery paused at the door, looking back at the office that had become the headquarters for everything she'd originally envisioned. Novacore could be. The walls displayed technical achievements and client testimonials, but also community impact metrics and diversity statistics that reflected their commitment to building a company that served all stakeholders, not just shareholders. "Schedule it," she said, "but I want to focus on the positive examples rather than the cautionary tales. The goal should be inspiring people to build better companies, not warning them about the obstacles they'll face." As they stepped out into the San Francisco evening, Avery's phone buzzed with one final notification of the day. A message from a startup founder in Berlin who'd read about Helix Labs' approach to international expansion and wanted advice about implementing similar privacy standards in European markets. The message ended with a line that captured everything Avery had been working toward. "You've proven that companies can succeed by serving users instead of exploiting them. That gives the rest of us permission to try, Avery." Lynn smiled as she walked toward her car, thinking about the ripple effects that would spread from this single day's work, the government services that would be more secure, the international partnerships that would expand privacy protections, the young entrepreneurs who would build their companies on ethical foundations, the industry standards that would prioritize user rights over corporate convenience. Jason Cole had used their marriage to steal half of her company, believing that legal ownership was the same as creative vision. But vision couldn't be stolen, competence couldn't be transferred through divorce proceedings, and the market always eventually recognized the difference between substance and manipulation. Now, as Helix Labs prepared to reshape the global authentication industry, Avery understood that her real victory wasn't defeating Jason, it was proving that technical excellence and ethical business practices could thrive together, inspiring others to build the kind of technology industry that actually served the people it claimed to help. The legacy would endure long after the revenge was forgotten. And that made all the difference. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.